the CGM of NABARD, Krishna, the Executive Director of IOB and the incoming convener of the SLBC, Srimati, Thiru Mahesh Kumar Bajaj, Executive Director, Indian Bank, my friend SML Swami, Regional Director, RBI, my colleague in the Planning and Development Department, ACS, Vikram Kapoor, ACS, Hansraj Verma, government officials, NABARD officers, bankers, my friends, good morning. Thank you for inviting me to this annual event, which I think I'm attending now for the second time. Every time I learn something new, and today has certainly been enlightening in many ways. I must first say that this is a very kind of role reversal situation, because as best I can tell, in the past, our Finance Secretary, currently ACS, Muruganandam, would be more likely to attend these meetings and SLBC meetings, and the Finance Minister would be away doing other things. Nowadays, I seem to attend the meetings more and free up the ACS Finance to work on the department work. And he's busy doing the government's work. I also want to acknowledge, though we get shawls in many different events, as soon as I saw the shawls being given here, I was reminded of my school days, where I studied in the Nilgiris in boarding school. And I said, these look like shawls from Ooty, from Nilgiris. And then the CGM said, maybe they're from the northeast. And then he corrected himself and he said, no, I found out they're from Ooty. So it's good that my memory is still working properly, going back 40 or 50 years. I also want to formally welcome our incoming SMBC coordinator, Madam, who gave a very brilliant and insightful speech about various aspects, including the value of technology and credit validation. I'll touch on that in a minute. But let me first step back. As I said in my remarks, I think the last time, credit is essential to any growing economy. In advanced economies like the United States, roughly 85% of all credit comes out of the markets, and only about 15% comes out of the banks. For various reasons, largely because we don't have such an efficient dispute resolution mechanism or a good, strong set of precedents. We have a highly underdeveloped market credit mechanism relative to the scale of our economy, relative to the total demand for credit. In fact, the availability of unsecured credit is very, very low compared to almost any other country, at least a developed country. So in that sense, as I said during my experience in commercial banking, particularly in emerging markets, bank credit is the driver of growth, because there isn't very often an efficient market credit mechanism. In that sense, in my banking career in the emerging markets, we used to assume that if GDP growth was going to be X, we should expect the loan growth to be 2X, largely in the large corporate and other sectors. Here I'm glad to see that while we're expecting GSDP growth about 15% notional, that the credit growth is targeted about 19%. It's not great, but at least the ratio is relatively good. Also, that the MSME sector is targeted for about 28%, which is very important, because that's really where the bulk of job creation and therefore follow-on benefits that come out of employment come. I was just checking with the CGM if Tamil Nadu is second at 110% CD ratio, what is number one? And Andhra is number one at almost 140%. And then, of course, there's after that Karnataka and then Kerala, because there's a lot of overseas deposits, remittances in Kerala. All that makes sense, but as I expected, and I was validated by the numbers, one of the reasons that Andhra is so high is because the deposit base is so low. So the deposit base of Andhra is less than half the deposit base of Tamil Nadu. So the same about 1 lakh and change difference between credit and deposit translates to 40% there and only about 10% here. But as good as things are, I would say the two things I observed: one, that the credit to green energy seems to be flat to marginally down. I'm a bit surprised given the push we have, but maybe you know something I don't granularly. The other thing I should say is that the use of technology is going to be the game changer, as the SMDC convener said. In my constituency, for example, before the broader state level initiative started, with the help of Indian Bank, we are very thankful for that, I started my own system of pruning and validating and cross-registering, set up my own software application, mobile, in my constituency, and we found a lot of discrepancies in the SHGs, a lot of multiple members, a lot of replications, a lot of cross deficiencies. I should also say, without picking the number, that this data purity project that we initiated after coming to office has yielded huge savings, both in the June loan waiver program, where we were able to really identify a lot of wrong beneficiaries. We were able to do that for the agricultural loan waiver program, but that was post hoc. We couldn't do anything about it because the predecessor government had already given up the, given releases. And then we were able to find how many of those had been fraudulent. But in the June loan, we caught it ahead of time. That saved us lots and lots of money. In the SHGs, just yesterday, I got a report from the Director General of Audit, which is a new post. To my knowledge, only exists in Tamil Nadu, no other state. But that was one of the reforms that I read out during my budget under the guidance of the Chief Minister. And we are profoundly reforming the nature of internal audit within the government. And I'm glad to see that this was one of the early benefits where we saved hundreds of crores by doing proper cross-referencing. In fact, maybe I'll just take a step back and say philosophically, though the Chief Minister, all of us in the party, in the Dravidian movement, we talk about social justice being one of our key drivers, the philosophy that activates us when we come to public life. We must remember that there's a profound difference between economic justice on the one hand and social and judicial or legal justice on the other hand. We are all, I'm sure, familiar with the image of the Lady of Justice. The Lady of Justice holds a scale in one hand, but is blindfolded. And in the case of the law, the Constitution, and social justice, it is crucial that the lady stay blindfolded. That is to say, the law must apply equally to everybody. You must not have different outcomes based on your caste or your religion or your gender or your any other variable. Therefore, justice should be blindfolded and the scale should balance. But when it comes to economic justice, it is exactly the opposite. Unless the blindfold is removed, there is no way for us to balance the scale. Unless we know who is making how much money, we don't know what the rate of taxation should be. Unless we know where there is economic weakness, we don't know who should get a subsidy. We simply cannot implement economic justice keeping the blindfold on. We have to know what is what. We have to have data. We have to be able to nuance and tailor our actions based on the status of the beneficiaries. Otherwise, there is no way to achieve economic justice or a leveling of the scales. In that sense, data gives us so much value, and the continuity of data over time, as the executive director said, gives us even more value. In fact, earlier this year, I was in Singapore for some meetings. At a different point in my career, I had served in a bank based in Singapore. Though I was a global head, the headquarters was in Singapore. And I had done a lot of work with the MAS, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, on some committees, and of course they were our regulator as well. But this time I stopped by to see the gentleman who runs the FinTech initiative. And one of the really good initiatives they have, which they're promoting to many emerging markets and developing countries, is a blockchain technology where MSMEs can cross-validate each other based on their record of payments, receivables, deliverables, frequency, lack of, failure to pay at the right time, consistency, etc. So you can get creditworthiness many ways, but 80-90% of the transactions that could go to proving creditworthiness or the health of an institution are not visible to everybody. And that's what I think the ED was saying. Broadly, the equivalent of having a syndicated database can be achieved many ways, including in blockchain cross-validation. So technology gives us a lot of insight, and it gives us the ability to fix one of the greatest weaknesses in our system. I said it a slightly different way at the last SLBC. The Honorable Union Finance Minister said it a slightly different way when she was in Chennai recently, a few days back. I said, though the targets are being achieved in terms of volume of credit, the diversification is not being achieved. If you look at the number of clients, we are significantly behind, 30-40%. Of course, it's much easier to lend more to the known client and the known track record. But for economic development or justice and for inclusive growth, we have to expand the net. We have to expand the number of people who are getting access to this. And there the biggest limitation becomes KYC, credit validation, etc. So these technologies can do that. The Union Finance Minister said, though the tax collections in Tamil Nadu are satisfactory to me, I worry that the target of number of individuals in the net is not going up. She said it from the collection side. I say it from the distribution side. So for all these, I think the value of technology and of institutional memory that persistence of data gives, which no human can replicate, should be the basis of driving a lot more expansion, diversification, and therefore economic inclusion and justice. I'll just end by saying that I'm very happy to note that every year the targets of these plans have been met or exceeded. I'm a bit concerned that the CGM's presentation showed, I didn't have my glasses with me, so I may have read it wrong, but it showed that this year it is only about 30 or 40% of the way, and we only have about 3 months left. But maybe that's because the roll dates of the loans come closer towards the fourth quarter. The fact that you have a track record of over-delivering for 3 years, I'll take it on faith that you'll do it this year also. So with that, let me commend all those whose work, as seen in the presentation, over multiple stages, and I'm sure many weeks and months, has culminated in the issuance of this very useful and valuable report. Every time I see it, I'm actually amazed that there's something like it, because I've not seen any other. I mean, though there are, in the US or in Singapore, the Federal Reserve, the central banks have wonderful data. Much of it is market data and bank data. It is not ground up data. And so this is, in my mind, quite unique still, at least in my limited experience, for something that is so granular, coming from the ground up, by district, by sector, and aggregating into this report. So I congratulate everybody who worked on it again. I thank you all for coming for the discussion today, and I will end my address. Thank you. I think the cases raised some very interesting points. I'll just touch the last one about the required rate of growth. So, last August, I think we published the white paper on the state's finances. So, I don't want to go back into various minutiae about it because I don't want to talk politics. But this last few years have not been the normal trajectory for Tamil Nadu. I said before pandemic. I'm not worried about pandemic. So in the white paper, I've shown that between 2006 and 11, the state experienced about 10.15% CAGR for 5 years. Though that's not the same as 8 years, 5 years. And that was despite the global financial crisis, despite other kind of headwinds during that period. So it's certainly achievable. I would say there's a second kind of benefit to us, which is that we're coming off a very low base because of the recession caused by the pandemic in the country and the very low rate, the positive 1.6% or 1.7% that Tamil Nadu had. We will have a bounce back effect this year. So we should see just the low base revalidation. So this year, my best guess is if our tax collections and our statistics elsewhere are any indication that we should hit 10% real growth. I'm not guaranteeing anything, but barring something dramatic between now and March. The real question is what happens in the next 4 or 5 years after that. And there I would say all these low base effects will be gone because we'll now have a new base of 22-23. There is one very good headwind and one very big risk. I mean, very good tailwind and one very big headwind risk. The tailwind is that all over the world, cost cutting, labor market tightness, supply chain disruptions, diversification away from China, you take any number of variables, all of them are moving India into a really sweet spot of opportunity. India broadly, I would say Tamil Nadu ought to capitalize on it because we are on average a very attractive proposition within India. That's a separate story. But the macroeconomic global trends are giving us this unique window of opportunity where there's a massive relocation of capital and jobs and operations from China, from even Hong Kong. In my old industry, in the financial services industry, there's a very big shift away out of Hong Kong and people looking for alternate locations. So even though there's a lot of risk in the air, there's also opportunity for India. The risk in the air for everybody is that we have never seen this kind of a situation where there's already trillions of dollars of excess liquidity sloshing around the system globally. And because of the massive fiscal stimulus, we have now seen 40-year, 30-year high inflation levels in most developed economies, which were not seen during 15 years of quantitative easing, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all sorts of monetary easing didn't result in the kind of inflation that 2 years of fiscal stimulus have resulted in. So it's not clear there is a soft landing from here, given the unprecedented situation, at least since the 1920s, 30s, there has never been this kind of a market liquidity and inflation situation. But even there, I would say, as problematic as there is for the global economy and as integrated as all our economies are today, therefore, the knock-on effects for India also will be negative and significantly negative based on the scale of the recession. On balance, the tailwinds ought to offset or really, even as people cut costs and lower employment in other places, they should be shifting more towards India, and Tamil Nadu should take its fair share, about 10% or more of these new opportunities. So I think on the equity and investment side, we see a decent situation. Now, of course, the way the capital structure works in India, there'll have to be a significant credit component after the equity component. CGM was just telling me in some industries they're also doing mezzanine financing to support, FPOs and so forth. So I think it's the within the macroeconomic trends that are going, some headwinds, some tailwinds, and relatively to the world, India is going to be in a relatively good place, and relative to the Indian average, Tamil Nadu should be in a very, very, very good place because of a lot of hedging that we have done in terms of liquidity, borrowing capacity, other things which we have not said publicly, but I made a commitment in the assembly that should a global recession hit, Tamil Nadu be better cushioned than most people. So I think that's the context, that even though there may be adversity, there will still be opportunity in adversity, and rightfully, as the ACS points out, what would be the credit component of that strategy, I think is something that, our banking colleagues in general, NABARD in the primary sector, but also all the other SLBC colleagues can maybe contemplate. It's a very uncertain time. This is not a normal year, let's put it that way. It's not a normal year either on the upside or on the downside. At least that would be my instinct.
The question is to the Finance Minister, Honorable Finance Minister. So from the macroeconomic perspective, if you look at the 1 trillion economy, I think we are focused on agriculture and rural development on one hand. On the other hand, you have the industry, and the third one is the service sector. So as a state focus paper, we couldn't see much on the service sector being captured. I can understand because it has been prepared by NABARD, which is having a more focus on agriculture and rural development. So we just wanted to understand how the trend, or what is your roadmap in terms of achieving that, if you are really looking at it. As you rightly said in your speech that it should be reversal, and the government should set the trend and ask for the credit atmosphere to ensure that it has been provided to the sectors. So if you look at in that perspective, we just want to get your views, that's one. And second thing, most of our state-related financial products, we also take financial assistance from World Bank or ADB or the developmental institutions. So when we have institutions like NABARD available in country, so what is the rate at which we are seeking those funds? Is that the dependency we can come out of it and rely on agencies like NABARD? So I just want to have your views on that also. Thank you.
I'd say the second question is a bit easier to answer in the sense that NABARD is already growing by leaps and bounds and increasing our credit limits or credit allocation quite significantly. In fact, that 1 year when chairman who just retired, Chintal, he had a target and we went up from 14,000 something crores to 27, almost double in 1 year. So, of course, we are happy to take whatever we can from NABARD. We are always sending additional proposals, asking for more, but they're a national bank. They have other commitments. When it comes to external funding, they're usually very low rate. The rate is not the problem. They also bring some other discipline. I don't want to get into that too much. It might have some other implications. But the big problem with external funding is that the government of India now takes a very aggressive stance. So, it's only natural. Bankers go where the credit is good. That's just the definition of good banking. So Tamil Nadu is very often number 1 or number 2 destination by volume, even by number of projects. For most of these development organizations, whether it's World Bank, ADB, or even bilateral like JICA, KFW, all of these, we get I would say, disproportionate share, at least our scale of the economy and maybe more. So the union government at one point, perhaps rightly, felt that they should be more distributed and other states should get more projects, and for a while they pushed very aggressively that no more than 1 project per state per year could be done. But the problem with that is you cannot force a bank to go where it doesn't want to go. You cannot force an agency to go where it doesn't want to go, where it has no track record. I mean, the same thing that we talk about applies to them also. So then actually after we came to office, I went and we had some extensive discussions. And we said, you encourage diversification in soft ways. You say, try to get to one new state every year or try to bring, one additional kind of dimension to your portfolio every year. But were you to constrain them to say you cannot give more than one project per state per year, effectively what would happen is the overall external credit given to India, or external aid or low cost development loan or whatever you want to call it. I mean, the difference between a grant and a zero interest 50-year loan is negligible, right? I mean, it's because of the time value of money paying back. So in that sense, I said what you would effectively do is hurt the overall capital or credit available to India. And so, they agreed to some extent, so then they took off the hard policy, then they tried different. Anyway, right now, you should not see these as competing avenues, right? We want to get the maximum we can from NABARD, knowing full well that NABARD has many places to service, and they will try to go to the poorest, weakest places first, especially when we're already at 110 CD ratio. That's their job, and we're happy for them to do it. Then we should get as much incremental funding from external sources as possible. The first question is a bit harder in the sense that there are different ministers who have different portfolios. I am only the finance and maybe much of the administration. I'm not the industries and commerce minister. So I don't want to tread on other people's portfolios or responsibilities. I can assure you that minister is very active. He goes to Davos every year, he goes on road shows, he has been in the Bay Area, he's trying to bring capital from many places. I think he went to Japan and Korea and so forth. But you see, there's at least 2 or 3 components to that. One is to get the fisc right first. Unless the state itself is in balance and investing in equity and doing the right kinds of things and not crowding out the debt market, then all the other things don't work. The second is to have a good credit environment to support that equity investment, or to have an external investment environment. I would say those are going reasonably well along. The third is to have the capacity to execute, which is engineering, design, EPC, kind of management bandwidth, project control and management, these kinds of things. ACS Finance, ACS P&D can tell you, we have a committee in the government that looks at all projects over 100 crores. And many times we find that we're not limited by money, we're limited by execution capacity. Because what happened when the state's fisc deteriorated, we went from spending 2.5% to 3% of GSDP on capital projects down to less than 1%. The capacity is not there in the market to execute. When you scale down like that, the ecosystem adapts. The people who have the capacity go and start working somewhere else. So now you have to build that capacity again when you're going back to a balanced fisc and 3%. The same way I would say that the last component is to have a qualified and skilled and employable, ready to be employed and produce workforce, like relatively high productivity, high skill workforce. I would say Tamil Nadu does better than most people, particularly in the service sector, most states, but we still have a lot to do, and the government's got a lot of initiatives like Naan Mudalvan and so forth for the reskilling. But specifically for the service sector, it's much easier for us to do service sector work than manufacturing or growth. Because service sector growth doesn't require the kind of lead time, the kind of equity to, the kind of credit ratio. It's only recurring expenses. It doesn't require 10 years sunk cost before you start getting returns and all that stuff. So I'm not as worried about the service sector component. I would say the agriculture component is a huge focus because it needs a significant transformation and move up the value chain from where we are, and elimination of a lot of the arbitrage and decay between the producer and the consumer. The manufacturing sector requires a lot of focus because you have to aggregate land, you have to get the proper clearances, you have to get the right amount of patient capital that will last for 5 or 10 years before it's returned. And you need to get expertise that you can't have domestically at that scale. Though, as I say, the tailwinds are good for us. The service sector is the easiest for us. We already have a big service sector base. We have a very talented, young, mobile workforce. When mobile can be outside Tamil Nadu, can be brought back. And places like Karnataka are going through a lot of turmoil and volatility. So even internally, there's a lot of tailwinds in our favor. And broadly, the service sector doesn't need as much credit. It's only working capital kind of credit. It doesn't need long-term credit relative to manufacturing, let's say. So that I don't think is the weakest area. But again, it's not my department, so I don't want to go too much more than that.